On the farm, I rode a huge horse, but I never expected to lose control of my own heart. My name is Ryan Montgomery, and I was born into a life of wealth and strict family expectations. My parents always told me who I had to be, what I had to achieve, and most importantly, who I had to love. But then, Jack Dalton arrived. Tall, muscular, and completely at home in the world I had never truly belonged to. I tried to ignore it, to fight it, but out here, away from the suffocating walls of my family's estate, I was about to learn that some things are impossible to resist. If you've ever felt trapped between expectation and desire, this story is for you. What would you do if you had to choose between love and family? Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. On the farm, I rode a huge horse, but I never expected to lose control of my own heart. The morning sun bathed the vast fields of my family's estate in a golden hue, the smell of fresh hay thick in the air. I had lived on this ranch my entire life, yet I never truly felt like I belonged. For my parents, the farm was just another piece of their empire, a symbol of our wealth, a legacy they expected me to uphold. But for me, it had always been an escape. That morning, as I approached the stables, I noticed a man I had never seen before. He was adjusting the saddle on one of our stallions, his broad shoulders flexing with each movement. Even from a distance, I could tell he was different from the usual ranch hands. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his tanned skin glistening with the sweat of hard labor. "Who's that?" I asked Mark, one of the older ranchers who had worked for my family for years. "New guy," Mark grunted, throwing a bale of hay onto the truck. "Jack Dalton. Hired him last week. Damn good with the horses." Jack Dalton. The name alone sent a strange ripple through me. As if sensing my gaze, he turned, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. My breath hitched. There was something in his stare, steady, unreadable, that made my stomach tighten. He nodded in acknowledgement before returning to his work. I should have looked away, kept walking, pretended like he was just another ranch hand, but I couldn't. Instead, I found myself walking toward him. "Ryan Montgomery," I said, offering my hand. Jack wiped his palm on his jeans before shaking mine. His grip was firm, calloused from years of hard work. "Jack," he said simply, his deep voice sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. I cleared my throat, trying to ignore the way his touch lingered even after he let go. "You've been here a week? I don't think I've seen you around." He shrugged. "I keep busy." I nodded, suddenly feeling stupid for striking up a conversation. Of course, he kept busy. The ranch hands had real work to do. Unlike me, the privileged son of the owner, who only rode the horses for fun and played at being a cowboy when it suited me. Just as I was about to walk away, Jack glanced at the horse beside him. "You ride?" His question caught me off guard. "Yeah," I said, recovering quickly. "Been riding since I was a kid." Jack studied me for a moment, then gave a small, almost amused smirk. "Maybe I'll see that sometime." It wasn't much, just a few words. But the way he said it, low, challenging, like he knew something about me I hadn't yet admitted to myself, made my pulse quicken. Before I could respond, Mark called Jack away, leaving me standing there, heart pounding in a way it never had before. As I watched him walk off, I realized something unsettling. I had just met Jack Dalton, and already I wanted him. The following days felt different. The air carried an unfamiliar weight, a tension I couldn't quite shake. I told myself it was nothing, just curiosity, nothing more. But every time I stepped onto the ranch, my eyes searched for him before I even realized what I was doing. Jack was always working, whether he was tending to the horses, mending fences, or moving hay. His focus never wavered. He barely spoke unless necessary, his presence a silent force of nature. And yet, he was impossible to ignore. One evening, just before sunset, I found myself by the stables again. It wasn't intentional. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I had saddled Storm, my favorite black stallion, hoping a ride would clear my head. The moment I swung onto the saddle, Jack appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Storm, huh?" he said, leaning casually against a wooden post. His voice was calm, but there was something behind his gaze, like he was studying me, figuring me out. I nodded, adjusting my grip on the reins. "Best horse we have?" Jack smirked slightly. "You sure about that?" I frowned, feeling the challenge in his words. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the fenced pasture. "You ever ridden Titan?" Titan. The most unpredictable horse on the ranch. Massive, powerful, and stubborn as hell. No one, not even the most experienced ranch hands, rode him for long without a fight. I scoffed. "Titan doesn't let anyone ride him." Jack raised an eyebrow. "I have." That caught me off guard. "You're serious?" He simply nodded. I looked at him, then at Titan, who stood in the distance like a beast waiting for his next victim. "All right," I said, dismounting from Storm. "Let's see it." Jack tilted his head, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. He walked toward the fence, whistling lowly. Titan's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Jack hopped over the wooden rail effortlessly, moving slowly toward the massive horse. I crossed my arms, expecting Titan to lash out at any moment. Instead, Jack approached him with a calm, deliberate energy. He murmured something I couldn't hear, running a firm but gentle hand down Titan's neck. And then, without hesitation, he swung himself onto the horse's back. Titan shifted, nostrils flaring, but he didn't buck. Instead, he stood still, as if waiting for Jack's command. I stared, my mouth slightly open. "How?" Jack gave a small tug on the reins, guiding Titan into a slow walk around the fenced area. The horse moved smoothly beneath him, responding to Jack's every movement with effortless trust. When he finally rode back to the fence and dismounted, he gave me a look. Horses aren't about control. They're about understanding. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I wasn't sure why, but the way he said it, his quiet confidence, the way he moved, the ease with which he commanded something so wild, sent a strange heat through me. Jack leaned against the fence, watching me. "You want to try?" I hesitated. Everything in me told me to say no, to walk away and pretend this moment meant nothing. But something else, something stronger, urged me forward. I climbed over the fence, my pulse hammering in my ears. Jack didn't move as I approached him, but I felt the weight of his gaze, like he was waiting to see what I would do. Titan watched me, his dark eyes wary. I reached out, hesitantly running a hand along his flank. His muscles tensed, but he didn't pull away. Jack's voice was low, almost coaxing. "Breathe. Don't force it. Just let him know you're here." I exhaled slowly, feeling my body relax. And then, in a movement that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, I swung onto Titan's back. He shifted beneath me, but I held firm, steadying myself. Jack stepped closer, his hand grazing my thigh as he adjusted the stirrups. The brief touch sent a jolt through me, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "You're good," Jack murmured, his voice near my ear. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus on the horse beneath me. I took a deep breath and nudged Titan forward. He hesitated, then obeyed, moving into a slow, steady trot. I couldn't help it. I laughed, the exhilaration of the moment washing over me. Jack chuckled. "Not bad, Montgomery."
When I rode back toward him and dismounted, we stood there for a moment, the golden sunset painting the sky behind us. I turned to thank him, but when our eyes met, something shifted. The air between us thickened. Neither of us moved, but I felt it. The unspoken thing that had been building since the moment we met. Jack's gaze dropped briefly to my lips, and I swore my heart stopped. Then, just as quickly as it came, he stepped back, clearing his throat. "See you around." And then he was gone, leaving me standing there, breathless and confused. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wanted it to happen again. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to pretend nothing had changed, but that was a lie. Everything had changed. Every time I stepped onto the ranch, I felt the weight of Jack's presence before I even saw him. It wasn't just attraction, at least not just that. It was something deeper, something that made my chest tighten whenever our eyes met. And the worst part? I had no idea what he was thinking. He was unreadable. One moment, he'd look at me in a way that made my skin burn, and the next, he'd disappear like nothing had happened. It drove me insane. One evening, after avoiding him all day, I found myself wandering toward the stables again. The sun was setting, casting an amber glow over the wooden beams and the open pasture beyond. My hands were restless, my mind tangled with thoughts I didn't want to admit. And then I saw him. Jack was in one of the stalls, brushing down Titan. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I lingered in the doorway watching him. His muscles flexed with every movement, his strong hands moving with a gentleness that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What? You just gonna stare?" I jolted. Jack hadn't even turned around. He knew I was there. Clearing my throat, I stepped forward, trying to ignore the way my heart pounded against my ribs. Didn't want to interrupt. Jack finally turned, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. "You ride today?" I shook my head. "Not yet." A slow smirk played at his lips. "Scared of Titan?" I huffed a laugh, stepping closer. "Not scared, just cautious." Jack nodded, considering that. Then, without warning, he tossed the brush onto a nearby shelf and stretched, his shirt riding up just enough to expose a sliver of tanned skin. My gaze flickered there before I could stop myself. I looked away quickly, but not quickly enough. Jack caught it. He stepped closer, closing the space between us until I could feel the heat radiating off his body. My pulse skyrocketed. "You keep looking at me like that, Montgomery," he murmured, his voice low, teasing. "And I'm gonna start thinking you want something." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My body was frozen, my brain short-circuiting at the sheer proximity of him. Jack's gaze flickered over my face, my lips, before he exhaled sharply and stepped back, shaking his head. "Go saddle up. I'll ride with you." It took me a second to process his words. Then, without thinking, I nodded and turned, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for the tack. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew one thing. This was dangerous. The evening air was thick with the scent of hay and leather as I tightened the saddle on Storm. My hands moved automatically, but my mind was somewhere else, still stuck on the way Jack had looked at me in the stable, the way his voice had dipped just enough to make my stomach flip. I needed to get a grip. Jack was a ranch hand. I was the son of the man who owned this place. There were 1,000 reasons why this shouldn't happen. And yet, when I glanced up and saw him saddling his own horse, something deep inside me whispered that it already had. We rode in silence at first, the rhythm of the horse's hooves the only sound between us.
The sky was painted in deep oranges and purples, the ranch stretching endlessly around us. Jack rode like he belonged to the land itself, his body moving effortlessly with his horse's strides. He didn't need to dominate the animal, he just understood it. The way he understood Titan, the way he seemed to understand me. "Where are we going?" I asked, breaking the silence. Jack didn't look at me. "Somewhere quiet." A flicker of nerve sparked in my chest, but I didn't question it. I followed him through the open fields, past the grazing cattle, until we reached a small grove at the edge of the ranch. The trees were tall, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Jack dismounted first, tying his horse to a low-hanging branch. I followed, my movements slower, more hesitant. As I stepped forward, he turned to face me. The air between us shifted, charged, electric. "I see the way you look at me," Jack said, his voice low but steady. My throat went dry. "Jack, you don't have to say it," he interrupted, stepping closer, "but you don't have to run from it either." I forced out a breath, my heart hammering. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jack huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You're a terrible liar, Montgomery." I swallowed hard, looking away. "Even if I hesitated, my hands clenching at my sides. "Even if there was something, it wouldn't matter." Jack's jaw tightened. "Why not?" "You know why." My voice was barely above a whisper. "My family, my father, they already have my life planned out. And this?" I gestured vaguely between us. "This was never part of the plan." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so calm it sent a chill down my spine, he said, "Then maybe it's time to make your own plan." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Make my own plan. Did I even know how? Jack took another step forward, closing the last bit of space between us. My breath caught as his fingers grazed my wrist, gentle, questioning. I could pull away. I could end this right now. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen as he leaned in, just enough that I could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint traces of leather and sweat. "This is your choice, Ryan," he murmured, his voice softer now. "No one else's." I exhaled shakily, my heart slamming against my ribs. For the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew, without a doubt, that I wanted him. The silence between us was deafening. Jack was so close I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and steady. His fingers still hovered over my wrist, his touch light but undeniable. He wasn't forcing anything, he was letting me decide. But deciding was the hardest thing I had ever done. Everything I had been taught, everything my parents expected of me, screamed at me to walk away, to pretend this moment wasn't happening, that I wasn't standing in the middle of a moonlit field, heart pounding, wanting something I was never allowed to have. But then, there was Jack. His patience, his quiet strength, the way he made me feel like, for the first time, I could breathe. And suddenly, for once in my life, I didn't care what was expected of me. I closed the distance between us before I could think twice, my lips brushing against his. It was hesitant, uncertain, but Jack didn't pull away. Instead, he exhaled against my mouth, his hand sliding up to cup my jaw. And then, just like that, the hesitation was gone. He kissed me back. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was steady, deliberate, like he had been waiting for this just as much as I had, like he wanted to make sure I felt every second of it. And God, I did. The world faded. the weight of my family's expectations vanishing as Jack's lips moved against mine. It was just us, just this moment. When we finally pulled apart, my breath was uneven, my pulse a chaotic drum against my ribs. Jack didn't say anything at first. He just studied me, his thumb grazing my cheek like he was memorizing me. Then, his voice low and certain, he said, "You don't have to hide who you are, Ryan." The words settled in my chest, heavy and inescapable. I swallowed hard, my hand still resting against his chest. "I don't know how to stop." Jack's expression softened. "Then let me show you." For the first time in my life, I wasn't scared of what that meant. The world felt different after that night. Everything had changed. Not just between Jack and me, but inside me. It was like I had spent my entire life holding my breath, and now, for the first time, I could finally breathe. But freedom came with consequences. The next morning, I walked into the house, my heart still pounding from the memory of Jack's lips on mine, only to be met with my father's icy stare from across the dining table. "Where were you last night?" His voice was sharp, edged with something dangerous. I swallowed hard. "Riding." It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. My mother, ever the silent observer, glanced between us, her grip tightening around her teacup. My father leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "With that ranch hand?" The air in the room shifted. My skin went cold. I forced myself to stay still. "Why does it matter?" My father's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I raised a man, not—" He stopped himself, inhaling sharply. Then, quieter, deadlier, he said, "I won't allow this, Ryan." Something inside me snapped. I had spent my whole life molding myself into what he wanted, his perfect son, his perfect heir. I had followed the rules, played my part, swallowed every desire that didn't fit into the future they had planned for me. But I wasn't that person anymore. I pushed back my chair and stood, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Then it's a good thing you don't get to decide anymore." My father's eyes flashed with rage, but I didn't give him the chance to speak. I turned and walked out, straight to Jack. I found him by the stables, tightening a saddle strap, like nothing had changed. But when he looked up and saw me, he knew. Something in his expression softened. "You told them?" I nodded, my throat tight. "It didn't go well." Jack studied me for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached out and pulled me into him. His arms wrapped around me, strong and steady, grounding me. I exhaled against his shoulder, feeling the weight of everything finally start to lift. "What now?" I whispered. Jack leaned back just enough to meet my eyes. "Now, we stop pretending." I let out a breathless laugh, my chest light for the first time in years. "That simple?" Jack grinned. "It's always been that simple, Montgomery." And just like that, I knew. I had made the right choice. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from who I was. I was running toward it, toward him, toward us. What would you choose? Expectations or love? Have you ever had to stand up for what you truly wanted? Let us know in the comments. And if you loved this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another emotional, unforgettable journey.